Hi, everybody. This is Cynthia Kane. Welcome back to UL100ZB, Research Skills, Information, and Technology for the week of March 25th, 2019, and our Gather module. So in this video tutorial, we're going to be covering Chapter 4 of the Information Literacy User's Guide, which deals with Gather. This is the fourth pillar of information literacy. Now, some of the things in this particular pillar, or in this chapter, we've already covered in our previous video tutorial for Plan. We've talked a little bit about paid and free resources, the difference between the two, how libraries do provide access to resources, sometimes according to their user population. And we've also talked about using a range of tools and strategies to retrieve and access information. Both of these video tutorials are going to feed directly into the learning assessment that you'll be doing for this week, which is a research plan. So we're going to be covering, first of all, 3 types of sources, and these types are actually going to become very relevant in one of the engagement activities you'll have a chance to do this week for your discussion board. Essentially, we're looking at 3 different types of sources regardless of format. And when I say that, I'm not even looking at print resources, online resources. I'm not looking at that particular format. I'm focusing more upon types of sources. So the first type is a primary source of information. And page 51 of chapter 4 of our textbook says that primary sources are accounts from a person or persons who have firsthand knowledge of the event. So a primary source can be a letter that somebody has written in a print form or an email. It can be a diary. So if you keep a diary or a journal, you actually already have a primary source of information that you've created. An autobiography. So if someone actually writes a memoir about themselves, or if a famous individual writes an autobiography, that is indeed a primary source of information from that person who has firsthand knowledge of the event. Primary resource, primary research that would be published in scholarly journal articles, that can also be considered to be a primary source of information. So some of you might be psychology majors. If you are reading articles in psychology journals that talk about empirical studies or experiments that someone has performed and then written about it based upon a hypothesis, that's actually also a primary source of information. Physical sciences can be the same way. Actually going out to the field, studying something, and then writing about it, that's also a primary source of information. I mentioned emails. So if you write an email and you actually are creating that, you've already created a primary source of information. At the same time, if you post something on social media, a commentary or an observation, again, you have already created a primary source of information. So you probably have created a lot of primary sources over the years. Another type of source can be considered a secondary source of information. And I like to think of these as sort of secondhand sources, one step removed from primary sources. So examples of secondary sources could be a biography. So the autobiography is a primary source of information that's written by that particular person. A biography, in contrast, can be something that somebody has written about a particular person. So that is one of the big distinctions between biographies and autobiographies. A critical analysis of the text can also be considered a secondary source of information. So I'm going to back up for just a second. If you are an English major or you're interested in literature, a novel, a short story, a play, a collection of poems, those are all actually considered to be primary sources because, again, written by a person with firsthand information about an event. In contrast, though, a journal article or a critical book about that play or short story or novel, that is a secondary source of information because it's not the actual play or novel. It's something that's talking about that particular work in a critical context. So that's a secondary source. A journal article that might talk about other people, other experiments that have been performed, but not the actual experiment, that journal article that is also considered to be a secondary source of information. So again, a secondary source can be one step removed from a primary source. And finally, there's a third source that you may not be familiar with when it comes to the actual term, and that's a tertiary source of information. A tertiary source can be actually removed from primary sources and secondary sources, because a tertiary source of information is a source that will lead you to primary sources and secondary sources. So if I am searching in a library's online catalog to see if that library owns books about something that I'm interested in, the library catalog in and of itself is that tertiary source of information. If I am searching in a database, such as the PsycInfo database, to find references to psychological journal articles, PsycInfo, which is the name of the database, is a tertiary source of information. So anything that might be a library-related database, Google can also be considered this way as well. Those are indeed tertiary sources. And another way of thinking about a tertiary source is looking at the end of journal articles for their bibliographies or references lists, kind of like the bibliography or the reference list or works cited that you list at the end of a research paper. That list, that bibliography, that references list, that list of works cited, that in and of itself can also be a tertiary source of information, because again, it's a listing of other primary sources, other secondary sources. So tertiary sources will get you to primary sources or secondary sources. Again, this is going to be key for the learning assessment and then also for one of our engagement activities that we have coming up. So there are different ways too of thinking about information formats. Chapter 4 also covers information formats such as Twitter and blog postings. I would actually just consider social media to be a whole information format in and of itself, the way that it communicates information immediately. Newspaper articles, either in print or online form, can also be considered to be some type of information format if I want more current information. Primary sources, scholarly journal articles, books, those are also considered to be different types of information formats. And you notice that I've noted on here that sometimes you do have to pay for access to information. We've talked a little bit about this in one of our previous video tutorials, that information can indeed be a commodity, and who has access to that information can be restricted by that commodity. So the Emporia Gazette is a good example. If I were to go to the Emporia Gazette online, which is our local newspaper, I can read some articles just in pure text for free, but I actually have to be subscribing to the print version of the newspaper in order to get access to a username and password to be able to access the PDF version online of that newspaper. I could also set up a separate account just to access the PDF online, but I'd have to pay for that access again. So that's always something to keep in mind when you're choosing which information formats might be appropriate for your research need. So we're going to be looking at primary, secondary, and tertiary sources here in just another context. I've always been very interested in the story of Anne Frank, who was in hiding with her family and some other friends of her family during the Second World War in the Netherlands. Of course, they were discovered, and then the only survivor was her father, Otto Frank. So probably a lot of you are familiar with her diary. So in terms of a primary source, there's something that exists in print that's called the Diary of Anne Frank, the critical edition. And that's actually a very interesting comparison of the different entries that she wrote in her diary when she was in hiding from 1942 to 1944. She wrote her original diary in a notebook and then also on loose leaf paper, whatever she could get her hands on at the time. But sometime in 1943, she was actually going back and rewriting her original diary entries because she was thinking that after the end of the Second World War, that she would like to publish her diary as an artifact of what she went through during that time frame. Sadly, she herself never had a chance to do that, but her father did. So a primary source could be her diary, and even going down a little bit further, the actual handwritten entries of her diary could be the ultimate primary sources of information. What did she write herself by hand? There's also a play that was written and performed in the 1950s, and the play is called The Diary of Anne Frank. Now, the information within that play could be a secondary source of information, but the actual creation of the play could then be considered to be a primary source if I am just looking at the play itself as an artifact, not the diary, but the play. So the play could also be a primary source of information as it exists as a play. We're going to be looking at just a second at another way to look at primary sources. A lot of special collections and a lot of museums and special libraries now have virtual exhibits that you can look at online, and you can just basically get a 360-degree view of an artifact, of an exhibit. It's a way of looking at it without actually being able to go to that museum or to that library directly, and I just find that to be fascinating. The Secret Annex, which was the building where Anne Frank and her family hid from 1942 to 1944, actually exists as a virtual exhibit. We're going to look at that in just a second. Secondary sources, biographies of Anne Frank, critical journal articles about her diary or about Anne Frank herself. Those are again secondary sources of information because they're commentaries, they're analyses, they're not the actual artifacts. Finally, a tertiary source of information. Remember that a database is a tertiary source because that's going to lead me to primary sources or secondary sources. So in this case, a tertiary source of information could be a database that we have through the library that's called Literature Criticism Online. So let's take a look at some of these sources and get a better sense of the way they work. So let's go first to the Secret Annex Online. What I did here was actually go to annefrank.org, which is the Anne Frank House in the Netherlands. And when I go in here, I have a little bit of information about the way in which the Secret Annex was accessed through a secret bookcase. And we're going to go back to the Secret Annex online tour. And as we go through here, we can actually step inside and take a look around and discover the Secret Annex. And this is the part that I find to be fascinating. You see what I'm doing here? I can look at this small hallway and this small entrance. And when I click here, this will let me zoom in a little bit closer to see how the bookcase actually opened and led to the secret entrance that led up to the rooms where Anne Frank and her family hid for 2 years. So this is a way that I can navigate within the Anne Frank house without actually being there as a primary source of information. So again, primary sources such as exhibits, virtual artifacts, and so forth can indeed be primary sources of information. So now we're going to go to the library's webpage, and I'm going to click on databases. And we did this in our previous video tutorial for plan. And this time I'm going to go directly to the letter L, and I'm going to a database called Literature Criticism Online. And this is the one, again, that would be considered a tertiary source of information. So Literature Criticism Online is actually going to lead me to a lot of articles in PDF that could talk about Anne Frank, perhaps also about her house. Remember that I mentioned the play, so I could find some secondary commentaries, some secondary sources about the play itself as a primary source of information. Let's just go up here to Anne Frank, and we'll just search. So what I'm getting here, again, anything that's labeled something called a review or in particular a critical essay, These are secondary sources of information, but I actually use the tertiary source called Literature Criticism Online to find these secondary sources of information. And some of these are reprints, but you can see I have some really interesting things here that I could look at. So I could click on this one called Remediation as a Moral Obligation, and we'll let this load. And you notice that what I'm getting here is actually more of a reference. There we are. There's the actual article that would be more of a critical review, the article itself. And this again, the article would be the secondary source of information. So I could read that and use that for any type of research that I might be doing. In our third video tutorial, I'm going to go over more specifically our assignments for this week. The Threshold Achievement Test of Information Literacy, which is actually 2 pre-tests that you will receive information about in your email. They are not graded, but they're a way for us to see the types of skills that you already have in terms of finding information, searching, evaluating, and then we'll be doing the same test toward the end of our course in a few weeks as a post-test. So that is an engagement activity. Another engagement activity that you can do for this week is a plan and gather discussion. I'll be going over that as well. And then finally, we have a second learning assessment called a research plan. And all of this will be covered in our third video tutorial.